I'm sure many of us have rented a place at some point in our lives. Renting is something most people will experience whether for work, school, or other reasons. For example, some might rent an apartment close to their workplace because their job is far from home, making commuting easier. Others might move to a new city for work, needing a place to stay. Today's story is about renting, so before we get into it, I'd like to give you a word of advice. When renting a place in the future, make sure to ask if anything unusual has happened there, especially if the rent is unusually low. Otherwise, you might end up with a lifelong shadow. This story is a bit long, so for your convenience, I'll tell it in the first person. Back in 2004, many of my high school classmates had graduated from college. One of the few who didn't go to university, foolishly attended several class reunions. One day, a friend told me that one of her college roommates had recently gone through some misfortune and was temporarily staying with him. She asked if I could help her out. I replied, "Is she a beauty?" She said yes, and I agreed to meet her later. That evening, I arranged to meet my friend the next day and get to know this beauty. The next morning, I spent 2 hours getting ready and went to a fast food restaurant in a plaza near my house where we'd agreed to meet. When I saw the girl, I immediately felt disheartened. While she had an oval face, her eyes were slanted and long. Her long hair, which I liked, had been permed into small curls, making her look a bit like a jellyfish. If I disregarded her hair and clothes, I thought she resembled the former South Korean president, Lee Myung-bak. The only difference was that Lee Myung-bak didn't have her well-defined nose or prominent chest. After we sat down, my friends started introducing us, and it felt a little like an arranged date. She emphasized that we were here to discuss something serious. The girl, whose name was Jian, had a rather gloomy expression, looking downcast, as people often do after encountering something frightening. After we ordered drinks, I hoped she'd tell me what had been happening to her. Jian shared that after graduating, she found a job in Chongqing and decided to stay there instead of returning to Guangdong. The company she worked for was far from the school, and since she had no reason to stay at the university, she began looking for a rental nearby. There were many students in Shapingba, and renting was common and relatively affordable. The only issue was that the apartments were old. She, a single woman who had just started dating a guy, wasn't at the stage of moving in with him, so she rented a one-bedroom apartment in an old workers' dormitory. It was on the ninth floor of a building that didn't have an elevator, as the building was quite old. She told me that if she had noticed the strange behavior of the real estate agency at the time, she would never have rented the place. I asked her what was so strange about the agency. She explained that she had just graduated, had little money, and was looking for something cheap. The rent was only 300 yuan a month, and she thought it was a great deal, especially since the apartment was on a high floor, which would make it safer. But the agency couldn't provide any photos of the apartment. Their excuse was that the previous tenant needed to rent it quickly and hadn't cleaned up or taken photos. Because of this, Jian requested to visit the apartment. But the agency only took her to the building's entrance and handed her the keys, leaving her to go upstairs on her own. She didn't think much of it, thinking it would be her first place in Chongqing, so she had a strange sense of affection for the apartment and even took photos of the whole process. She said the climb was tiring, and when she opened the door, there was a lot of dust, as if no one had lived there for a long time. The room was full of junk, and there were posters of celebrities left behind by previous tenants. It wasn't a complete mess, but it was definitely very disorganized, almost like someone had hastily left in a panic, leaving things behind. Right in front of the door was a large TV stand with a pair of speakers on either side. Curiously, a small black and white TV was placed on top. The walls were decorated with pictures of the god of wealth and New Year dolls, along with a large, faded patch, which likely was from a large mirror or New Year's painting. The decoration looked like something from the 90s with wall lights, one of which had an old calendar hanging underneath, its date stopping at July 12, 2001. She mentioned that the kitchen was also messy with pots and pans left behind, but there was a small balcony with decent natural light. At the time, she didn't notice anything odd, aside from a mess that needed cleaning. She actually liked the place. After taking many photos, she went back downstairs, signed a lease, paid, and got the keys. The agency told her to clean it up herself or hire someone, and they'd reimburse the cost. Jian was happy with this arrangement, feeling that the agency was pretty straightforward. The next day, she hired someone to clean and bought daily necessities, moving in that very night. When she told me about the agency, I thought it was very unusual. I've rented before, and agencies don't typically operate that way. They usually provide the landlord's contact info for utility payments, which wasn't the case here. It seemed like Jian didn't have enough experience and hadn't picked up on the agency's odd behavior. Jian continued, saying that for the first few days, everything seemed normal. The utilities worked fine. In older apartments, there can be issues with electricity, but in her case, every light worked, and even the old black and white TV still received several channels. Though she wasn't into TV, spending most of her time on her laptop, she didn't mind the TV. However, the only thing that bothered her was the sound she heard at night, especially around midnight. It sounded like someone was walking quickly back and forth above her. The sound wasn't very loud, but at night it was clear. She assumed it was a child from the apartment above playing and didn't think anything of it. Eventually, she got used to it and didn't pay much attention to it. But a few days later, she encountered her first truly strange experience, and from there, things escalated quickly. I could see that she was getting anxious as she spoke, nervously rubbing her fingers together. My old classmate noticed this too and tried to comfort her, saying, "Don't be afraid. My friend specializes in this kind of thing. Just tell him everything." Jian took a deep breath, then began to recount the terrifying events she experienced. A few days later, one evening, Jian and her new boyfriend had just finished watching a movie, and he walked her home. Seeing how high her floor was, he offered to walk her up. As they reached the stairwell between the 8th and 9th floors, they decided to kiss secretly. The lights in the corridor were motion activated, and as they were in the middle of their kiss, they suddenly heard the sound of a child coughing. The lights came on, and to their horror, they saw a little girl dressed in orange with 2 pigtails grinning at them from a small garbage chute at knee height. Jian and her boyfriend were terrified. Her boyfriend, panicking, shoved her aside and ran off. Jian, pushed by him, stumbled and almost fell into the garbage chute. She said her legs went weak from fear, and she struggled to get up but couldn't. She tried to scream, but her throat felt blocked and no sound came out. In desperation, she crawled backward on the floor, her eyes locked on the little girl, who slowly emerged from the chute. The girl's smile remained as she reached out with a dirty hand, as if to touch Jian's face. Terrified, Jian managed to break free from her paralysis, jumped up and ran upstairs, slamming the door shut, locking it and barricading it with a chair. At this point, she suddenly stopped as though she was scared by her own narration once again. To be honest, I was sitting in a fast food restaurant with the air conditioning on, repeatedly rubbing my arms, trying not to let them notice the goosebumps that had started to appear from the shock. I have quite an imagination, so whenever someone tells me a story, I can't help but vividly picture the scene in my mind. As a result, I often end up scaring myself with my own imagination. Even though I work in this field, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. People are naturally afraid of death, and ghosts are a product of death. When faced with trouble, I try to find a way to solve it, but if I can't and danger is near, I'll run faster than anyone. I ask her, "What about your boyfriend? Can we contact him? It would be good to know more about the situation." She shook her head and said, "I can't find him. Ever since that night, his phone has been off. How pitiful. It's one thing if he can't be found, but a man with such a low character deserves to live the rest of his life remembering that terrifying moment." I then asked her, "What happened next?" She said, "After I got home, I calmed down a little, but I started doubting if I had imagined it all. After all, people who study science tend to be more rational. But everything had been so specific, so detailed, that it was hard for me not to believe it. I tried to talk myself out of it, only to contradict myself over and over, and I became so exhausted. So, I turned on all the lights in my room and got into bed. She told me that her bed was against one wall, and the opposite side faced a small balcony. She didn't dare sleep with her back to the wall, so she pressed her back against the wall and slept on her side, facing the balcony. Even though it was summer, she covered herself with a blanket out of fear. She was so tired but couldn't fall asleep. Her mind kept drifting back to the horrifying scene from earlier. Her eyes opened and closed repeatedly, and around 2 a.m., still wide awake, she noticed something strange. Through the faint light from the balcony, she saw a small silhouette in backlight. It had two little braids, and she immediately thought it was the same one she had seen earlier in the trash can, and she was certain it was a ghost, not a person. The room's lights didn't reach the balcony, so she couldn't make out the ghost's face. She wanted to run, but she was afraid the ghost would chase her, which would be even more terrifying. So, she covered her head with the blanket. The air under the blanket was stifling, but she didn't dare lift her head. After a while, the blanket above her slowly started to rise. Terrified, she quickly shut her eyes. She said that the last image she saw before closing her eyes was a few small fingers lifting the corner of the blanket as if trying to crawl in beside her to sleep. Sure enough, even with her eyes closed, she could feel the presence of someone lying beside her. She kept her eyes tightly shut, but suddenly, two hands pulled her eyelids open. Through the light filtering through the blanket, she saw the little girl, almost nose to nose with her. The girl deliberately opened her eyes so that she could see her. According to the girl, her expression was the same as before, but it was clear her hands and face were filthy, as if she had crawled out of a garbage heap. Her teeth had black grime on them, and her eyes were narrowed into crescent shapes as she grinned menacingly. I rubbed my arm again as goosebumps had risen once more. She continued. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore. I started hitting and kicking frantically, but it felt like I was hitting nothing but the blanket. I hadn't taken off my clothes the night before, so it saved me some trouble. I struggled to get out of bed, grabbing my phone, but nothing else. I ran out of the room, but foolishly locked the door behind me, thinking I could lock the ghost inside. The noise was loud enough that it triggered the motion sensor lights on every floor. The worst part was, as I passed the trash chutes on each floor, the little girl was always there, smiling at me just like the first time I saw her. Every floor, every single one, she said. Once I made it to the street, I desperately flagged down a taxi and rushed to my friend's house. On the way, I called my friend, and she ended up paying for the fare. After that, I never returned to that place, and the little girl didn't follow me to my friend's house. I didn't go to class and stayed at my friend's place, too scared to go anywhere. I let out a soft sigh. Just listening to her experience sent chills down my spine. After hearing her tell the story, I was so shaken that my heart was pounding. At that time, I had only recently started working independently, and I didn't have much experience. To be honest, at first I was hesitant and thought it might just be too terrifying. I'm especially scared of ghosts of children because, while they're tragic, they can be mischievous and difficult to communicate with. So I asked her, how old did the girl look? She replied, about 5 or 6. Hearing that, I grew even more worried. That meant the child had died young, which made things even harder to deal with. I suddenly remembered she had mentioned taking many photos during the first house viewing. I asked if I could see them. She said she had been in such a rush to escape that she didn't take anything with her, and all the photos were still in the house. She handed me the keys, begging me to go retrieve her computer and camera. Then she started crying, asking me to save her. At that time, I was a bit soft-hearted, and when she cried, it really hit a weak spot in me. Without thinking too much, I agreed. All right, I'll help you. After getting the keys, I told my friend to take care of her while I went to get her stuff. I'd be at their place afterward, so we could discuss things in more detail. Following the address she gave me, I found the building in a small alley. It had 4 entrances, and from the entrance, I could see a fenced-off stairway. Alongside the stairway, there was a protruding section, which I guessed was the trash chute that ran through the entire building. The stairwell walls were covered in posters for lockpicking, STD treatments, and fake ID services. As I passed each trash chute, I couldn't help but be extra cautious, worried that the little girl would be staring at me from inside. Thankfully, it was daytime, so I felt a bit braver. By the time I reached the 9th floor, I was out of breath. Whoever designed the building had put 10 steps between each floor. When I opened the door, the lights in the room were still on, so I assumed she had been using a lot of electricity in the days she spent fleeing. I took out a compass and some string, moving carefully. Before entering, I tossed some rice by the door for protection. The room felt very active with spiritual energy as I walked through, but it was the same spirit. This could mean one of two things. Either the spirit was very protective, or it had been following me the whole time in places I couldn't see. Soon, I found the camera and computer on her desk. I packed them up along with a few change of clothes for her. After turning off the lights, I left and went downstairs. The tense feeling lifted as I was relieved not to have encountered anything truly sinister. I called my friend and told her I'd be over soon, then took a taxi to their place. At her house, I plugged the camera into the computer. Aside from some random selfies, I found the photos she took when she first entered the house. She had described the room, and it was pretty much what I expected. I knew that sometimes cameras could capture ghosts that the human eye couldn't see, so if the little girl's ghost had something to do with the house, maybe there was some clue in her random snapshots. I carefully examined the photos, and sure enough, I found some traces. Among all the photos, I carefully examined each one. My guess was correct. Ever since Miss Jian started taking photos when she entered the room, the ghost of that little girl had been following her. Although I've been involved in this kind of event for years, I can't say I fully understand the thoughts of ghosts, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that they are driven less by thought and more by simple instinct. So, my first thought was to consider the instinct of this little girl. Children are naturally playful, and if you told me a child wanted to harm someone with intent, I doubt I would believe it. In all those photos, normal people wouldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I noticed several where a very blurry face of a girl appeared. It seemed like she intentionally ran into the frame, wanting to be in the photo. This suggested she wasn't afraid of being discovered. It's worth mentioning that I've seen countless supernatural photos in my life, many of which I've kept locked away, various types. But most of them only show body parts like hands, feet, or shadows. Photos that actually show a face aren't as common in my collection. And my experience tells me that if a ghost lets you see it, if it even opens your eyelids to make sure you see it, it's not trying to kill you. It's probably just a simple-minded being. Out of a few dozen photos, at least 10 of them looked odd. The oddness wasn't because they were supernatural, but because the photos only showed heads with no bodies. This really scared me. I thought, could it be that I was encountering a type of ghost, like a spirit with missing limbs? If that was the case, I would have no choice but to tell Miss Jian to move out and head to a temple for protection. The process of analyzing the photos took quite some time. After looking through them, I arrived at two conclusions. First, the little girl's death was definitely linked to the garbage chute. She might have died in there. Otherwise, I can't think of any reason she would be appearing in the entire garbage passage. Second, this little girl had definitely lived in the house Miss Jian rented, whether she was a tenant's child or the owner's. Her death was definitely tied to that house. Despite my fear, I decided I had to at least try to gather more information. So, I told Miss Jian that I wanted to go back to the place she rented and ask around with the neighbors to see if I could find out anything. Miss Jian was clearly very resistant to the idea, and it was understandable. If I had experienced what she went through, I might have wanted to jump out of the window too. However, I didn't think the little girl's ghost was there to harm her. Instead, I thought the ghost either didn't like her and wanted to scare her away, or simply wanted to play with her. When I told her, she refused, saying she would never go back to that place. My classmate had to stay and accompany her, so they couldn't come with me. Therefore, I had to go by myself again. Fortunately, I didn't need to enter the apartment this time. I just had to be careful not to encounter the little girl's ghost in the garbage chute. Arriving at the building again, I saw a few middle-aged women sitting under the trees downstairs, probably enjoying the shade. They seemed to be watching me, possibly because I was a stranger. This kind of gathering was a great opportunity for me. At least it meant they knew each other, and they had likely lived there for a long time. They probably had some knowledge of what had happened in that building or to that family. I approached them, greeted them with a hello, aunties, and casually steered the conversation to ask if they knew where the woman who rented Unit 9 to 2 was. I needed to talk to her about something. When I mentioned the apartment, I noticed the women's expressions change. One of them even stood up and seemed ready to leave. After she walked away, another woman paused for a while, then asked me, "Young man, why are you asking about this? Is the girl your friend?" I told her she was a classmate of mine and I came to collect something from her, but she wasn't home. The woman was silent for a moment, then gave me an elder's warning. "Young man, you should tell that girl to move out. That apartment is bad, really bad." I had already suspected something was off, so I asked, "What's wrong with it? Is it because the house is too old? I heard it's pretty cheap." The woman smiled and said, "No, it's not that. You're better off moving out." Before that girl moved in, the apartment had been vacant for years. I asked, "Why was it vacant?" She replied, "It's better not to ask about that. Just trust me on this one." She shook her fan and left. That confirmed it. The neighbors around here definitely knew the story behind that apartment. I didn't go upstairs because I was too scared to see something terrifying in the hallway. So I waited downstairs. Later, an elderly man in a blue shirt with rolled up sleeves and holding a fan came out of the unit where Miss Jen had lived. I greeted him and asked if anything unusual had ever happened in the building. He stopped and looked at me with a slightly surprised expression, similar to the reaction of the woman. There was a hint of mystery and reluctance to talk. He asked, "Why do you want to know?" I told him my friend had lived there but had become too scared to come back, so I wanted to know if anything had happened in that building. I figured it might be better to tell him the truth in a roundabout way. The old man stared at me for a while, probably deciding whether to tell me. Finally, he gestured for me to sit down with him under the shade of a nearby wall. Then, he shared what he knew. In the first half of 2001, something tragic happened to the family living in Unit 9 to 2. The parents, who worked at a local company, had a lovely daughter. But that year, the girl died in a strange accident. Her body was discovered at the bottom of the building's garbage chute, already dead. After an investigation, it was determined that she had fallen from between the 8th and 9th floors of the building. The parents were devastated, but because the circumstances were unclear, whether it was suicide, an accident, or even foul play, the entire building cooperated with the police investigation. The final conclusion was that it was an accident. No one knew how the accident happened, and the police did not release further details, only assuring the family that justice would be served. The neighbors, feeling it was inappropriate to press the family for answers, also kept quiet. A few months later, the family moved away. I asked the old man where they went, but he didn't know. He said the family had hired movers to pack up everything in one go, and no one knew where they had gone. It was only after they left that the neighbors felt free to talk about the incident. The old man told me, "Let me tell you, that apartment is cursed. Every July, people living next door or above and below hear the sound of a child running on the floor above. The noise seems to come from the family living in Unit 8 to 2. The neighbors started burning paper offerings every year and even put mirrors on their doors. Some even set up altars inside their homes, fearing that the evil energy from that family might spread to theirs. After that, people were supposed to install small iron doors on all the garbage chutes, but no one wanted to take the lead because they were too scared, so it was never done. Many people even stopped throwing their trash down the chute and would carry it downstairs instead." From what the old man said, I knew that the neighbors were well aware of what had happened in that apartment. I decided to take a risk and contact the real estate agency. Since they had helped rent the place, they must have the landlord's phone number. I didn't think I'd be doing this if I weren't feeling so reckless. That day, I stormed into the agency like a bully and grabbed the first agent I saw, demanding to know why they had rented me a haunted apartment. The staff was startled by my sudden outburst. Someone tried to pull me back, and I pretended to calm down, releasing my grip. After sitting down, the manager came over to ask what was going on. I told him, "Don't think I don't know. You rented my girlfriend a haunted apartment." Then I told them we had encountered strange things, like a woman's head flying around at night and singing songs, and slippers walking around by themselves. I couldn't take it anymore. They had to give me the landlord's contact info. If they didn't, I was going to make a huge scene and advertise their business for them. The manager, worried by my words, talked it over with the other supervisors. Eventually, they gave me the landlord's phone number. Before I left, I told them, I know you're just doing business, but don't do it at the expense of people's safety. You made a little money, but you might end up causing someone's death. I left with the number in hand. It was my first time trying to intimidate someone, and I was still nervous, but it worked. At least I got what I needed. Next, I called the landlord. I had obtained his name from the real estate agency, and since this whole situation was caused by his deceased daughter, I decided not to hold back. When he picked up the phone, I went straight to the point. Sir, your deceased daughter's spirit is still haunting the house you rented out, causing disturbances. I need to meet with you in person. Otherwise, things could get out of hand. At first, he tried to hang up, but I told him this might be the only chance anyone would offer to help him with this matter. His daughter had been dead for several years, and yet she hadn't left. Could he really bear that? There was a long silence on the other end before he finally agreed to meet. He told me he was at Lishawan running a small grocery store and asked me to come there. I was familiar with Lishawan as I used to play pool there with friends during my school days, so I quickly found the store. When I entered, I told them I was the one who had called. A middle-aged man with a dejected expression silently lowered the metal shutter at the door. I hoped this wasn't some prelude to a violent act, like him trying to dismember me in the shop. Once the door was secured, his wife walked out from the back room, holding a baby that seemed only a few months old. To break the silence, I asked the man, "Is this your wife and child?" He nodded, but didn't say anything more. The atmosphere grew tense again. I gathered my thoughts and then told the man everything that had happened to the girl, including the situation she had faced before. After hearing this, he seemed visibly disturbed, while his wife tried to comfort the baby and wipe her own tears. I've learned a bit from the neighbors about what's been going on, and that's how I found you through the agency. I've been sent by your current tenant to help guide your daughter's spirit, but I need to understand why she's staying there. Otherwise, even if I have a way to force her out, it could be difficult for you and your family to accept, both emotionally and in terms of your future karma. So, I need you to tell me exactly what happened the day your daughter passed away. I know it's painful, but it's something that has to be addressed. After a long pause, the man spoke up. But instead of telling me the truth, he made a request. He wanted to see the photos the girl had taken earlier. He said he hadn't allowed anyone in the family to talk about it, and while he wasn't dismissing me entirely, he needed to see proof before he could speak. I had no choice but to call the girls and ask them to bring the computer to Lishawan. We were so close to unraveling the truth, but if they were too scared to come, we wouldn't be able to move forward. The two girls arrived shortly after, and we all gathered around the table. I started showing the man and his wife the photos I had found, analyzing the details. One particular photo was so clear, it almost looked fake. In it, the child's face was crystal clear, exactly as the girl had described, her crescent-shaped eyes and a wide grin. It wasn't frightening, but it was eerie. As a parent, how could they not be heartbroken to see their daughter, half-transparent, standing in front of the camera, smiling like that, when she had passed away years ago? The tears in the man and his wife's eyes told me they had already accepted that the girl in the photo was their daughter, who had died in an accident years ago. I asked, "Now that we have everyone here, can you tell us what happened? This might be the only opportunity for both you and us to find closure." The man wiped his tears and began to speak. He told me that both he and his wife used to work at the same company, and their life was relatively stable and happy. In 1996, they had their daughter named Mau Mau. At first, they both hoped for a son, so they had already picked out a nickname for the baby before she was born. Mau Mau's personality was a lot like a boy's, mischievous and full of energy. When both parents were at work, they'd send her to kindergarten, but on days off, they always played with her. He said Mau Mau, though young, was the family's source of joy. One day, after he had a tough day at work, he came home in a bad mood, only to feel better when Mau Mau cheered him up. She had learned to dance at kindergarten and performed it for her parents, making everyone laugh and forget their worries. The man felt that although he hadn't had a son, he had been given a precious daughter, and all his love as a father was poured into her. Life felt short, but he believed the greatest happiness was seeing his child grow up joyfully. Even if he had to endure hardship at work, everything he did was for her and the family. Despite loving his daughter, he admitted he never truly understood her world. Their apartment was small with only one bedroom, so Mao Mao slept in the same room as them. But he had planned to earn more money and buy a second house so that his beloved daughter could have her own room when she was older. He went on to say that on the day of the accident, he was at home resting while his wife was at work. Since he had more time at home, he decided to spend it with Mao Mao, who had been asking him to play games with her all morning. She suggested playing hide and seek, but the house was too small for that. He then proposed they hide something instead. Mao Mao agreed. He took a poster, one she had torn from the wardrobe a few days before, and said, "Let's hide this. I'll hide it first, then you try to find it." He planned to hide it somewhere not too easy to find, so she would have to search a bit longer, giving him more time to rest. As I looked at the wardrobe in the photos, I noticed the posters and the stickers on the walls weren't typical choices for a 5-year-old. He explained that the posters were from his own youth in the 90s, and the stickers were from when he was even younger, during the era of Saint Seiya. Mao Mao, who had a boyish nature, had far fewer stuffed animals than other girls, and often sang adult songs her father taught her. He said it was both funny and adorable watching her sing grown-up songs in her childish voice. That day, after he hid the things, he rested on the sofa while his daughter wandered around the house, searching everywhere. The items were hidden deeply, and the daughter searched tirelessly. After a long time, she finally found them. Excited, she ran over to her father and told him she had found them, saying it was now her turn to hide and that he should search for her. He agreed, telling her to go ahead and hide and call for him when she was ready. The daughter, being clever, knew that hiding in the room would be too easy for her father to find her based on her height. So, she opened the door and decided to hide in the hallway. However, she never returned. Instead, all that was left was her lifeless body. At this point, his nostrils flared, and his eyes turned red. He said that after he couldn't find his daughter, he spent the entire night searching for her and asking around. The next day, an elderly woman collecting trash found his child's body in a garbage pile. It was unbearable for him. He regretted not spending more time with her, not playing with her as he should have. If only he had been there for her, this tragedy might have been avoided. For all these years, he had been filled with regret. But life moves on, and after cooperating with the police to close the case and handling his daughter's funeral, he and his wife continued to live in that house. They often saw their daughter's shadow, and the pain in their hearts was unbearable. Eventually, they both quit their jobs, packed up, and moved to start over. He remembered that day clearly, July 12th, 2001, the very date he saw on the calendar when Miss Jian entered the house. After moving, the couple was lost and unsure about how to begin their new life. But eventually, he overcame his emotional struggles and opened a small supermarket. Business was decent, and this year, his wife gave birth to their second child, their only child now, a boy. He said that every time he looked at the infant in his arms, he thought of his deceased daughter. Over the years, the mental and emotional toll, combined with his self-blame, had been tearing them both apart. Eventually, they both silently agreed not to talk about the past or the child. I asked him how the child had ended up in the garbage chute. He said that after discussing it with the police, they deduced that the child must have tried to hide the poster in the chute, hoping her father wouldn't find it. But how could such a small child understand the danger? She might have leaned in to find a spot to hide it, lost her balance, and fallen. The police had found her fingerprints between the 8th and 9th floors and bloodstains where her head had hit. The same injury was found on her body. So the conclusion was that while trying to hide the poster, she accidentally bumped her head and fell. So everything made sense. Poor Mao Mao. Just as I had guessed earlier, she never intended to hurt or scare Miss Jian. She simply wanted her to play with her. But because she died tragically and had lingered as a spirit for so many years, her innocent intention became something frightening to us living people. We never considered that her actions were just a way of reaching out, one that we failed to understand. I asked the man if the poster had been found. He said yes, it was found, and Mao Mao had stuck it to the wall on her side. I then asked, "Where is the child buried now?" His wife interjected, saying she was so young. According to customs from our hometown, we just cremated her. We didn't buy a burial plot. Instead, we placed a spirit tablet for her on the second floor of our shop to honor her ashes. When I turned to look at my classmate and Miss Jen, they were both crying, deeply moved by the tragic fate of the child. I asked the man and his wife for permission to return to the house once more. The child's spirit was surely still there, but I didn't think she would willingly follow me. I even doubted whether she knew that she had already passed on. With the background of Mao Mao's story, Miss Jian was clearly less afraid now, but she still couldn't face what she had seen before. Mao Mao's parents also said they didn't want to go back to the house, so I had to go alone, understanding their emotional hesitation. Even though I felt sympathy for the child more than fear, I was still uneasy. On my way there, I figured out how to draw the child's spirit out, as she might not come to me just because I called. The final step was risky, and whether I succeeded or not depended on this moment. When I reached the ninth floor, I held the compass in my left hand, carefully observing. It was almost 9 p.m., and the night always made my work seem more terrifying. I decided to provoke Mao Mao to force her to appear, so I could confront her. Though it wasn't entirely fair, I felt it was necessary for her to go where she belonged. I approached the wardrobe, where the mark of the torn poster was still visible. I reached out and peeled back one corner of the remaining poster, keeping my eyes on the compass. Thankfully, the reaction was mild. As I gradually peeled the corner back further, I took a deep breath and ripped the poster off. This caused a much stronger reaction from the compass, just as I expected. It meant I had angered her. I immediately ran, heading toward the garbage chute between the 8th and ninth floors, hoping to put the poster back where Mao Mao had hidden it. To remind her of that day, at least it would help her realize she was dead and no longer belonged in this world. As soon as I opened the door to the garbage chute, I felt a strange tightness on my face. I knew Mao Mao was attacking me. I ran as fast as I could, but my steps felt heavy, and I struggled to reach the chute. I held my breath, braving the awful stench and fear in my heart. I leaned in, sticking the poster on the inner wall. The noise was loud enough that the motion-sensing lights on the 6th, 7th, and 8th floors all turned on. Looking down the chute, I saw 3 glowing holes confirming the lights. But what was terrifying was that I saw a little girl in yellow clothes with pigtails, her once cheerful expression now twisted into a fierce, angry glare, crawling up the chute toward me. The light from the 6th floor garbage chute revealed her. Panicked, I scrambled to grab some grave soil from my bag and desperately poured it over her head. My fingers scraped against the inner wall, and the nail of my right middle finger broke. After the soil hit her, Mao Mao's ghost disappeared, but she didn't vanish completely. Gasping for breath, I crawled back from the chute and turned to find her crouching right in front of me, still glaring at me with an intense, angry expression. I quickly stepped back. I figured the grave soil might have scared her off a bit. This time, she didn't lunge at me but kept glaring. I leaned against the wall, my eyes fixed on her, and slowly backed away to the 9th floor, retreating into the bedroom with the wardrobe. She followed me, walking lightly, almost like she was gliding, her steps had no weight, as if floating like Michael Jackson's moonwalk. I could tell it was just her habit. Once in the room, I threw the compass onto the bed, grabbed the rope, and prepared to perform a calming chant. Gradually, her expression softened. When I was sure she had calmed down and was no longer angry, I told her, "Uncle is going to take you to a better place." She was just a child now, and she curled up on the floor, hugging her knees. I wasn't sure if she understood me, but when I tied the red string around her, she didn't resist. After taking her away, I cleaned the wounds on my hands and wiped the sweat from my back. I regretted not turning on the air conditioning when I first entered the house. After double-checking the place and ensuring it was completely clean, I left and went back to the shop where Mao Mao's parents were. My classmates and Miss Jian had been waiting for me for a long time. When they saw me return, Their first concern was whether I had sent the child away. Their complete disregard for my injuries irritated me, but I let it go. I told them everything went smoothly. Any issues I kept to myself. Before leaving, I advised Mao Mao's parents to pick a good day to take their child's ashes to a temple for spiritual offerings. After all, she had been a ghost for so many years. Though she hadn't hurt anyone, her negative energy was heavy. The temple would help her by letting her hear Buddhist scriptures. I also told them to buy a proper burial plot when she reached 8 years old in the afterlife, so she could be properly laid to rest. Her father nodded tearfully in agreement. Sadly, they didn't give me any money. On the way back, Miss Jian told me that in a few days she would be packing up her things and moving out. I knew she couldn't quite get past her own barriers, and since we're all ordinary people, I completely understood. Even though the place had been cleaned up thoroughly, I still advised her. I said, although everything is behind you now, you're someone who's seen a ghost. When you have time off, make sure to visit the temple and burn some incense. If possible, check on Mao Mao too. I then told her that in the future, when renting a place, she should be cautious. Avoid houses with a huge discrepancy between their conditions, amenities, and price. While it might not always be a haunted house, it's not worth risking it just for a deal. Also, if the house is too rundown, she should remember to scatter rice to honor the spirits before entering. If the house feels oppressive or the lighting is poor, or worse, if the bedroom has no windows, she should avoid renting it. Another thing, if the bed is facing west, and if she doesn't mind the trouble, she could try moving it. Adding some plants would help too, because a bed facing west is said to attract spirits. If you're interested in my videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.